Okay, on to our next speaker, Mr. Matthew Lister, who is going to be talking about repairing the fabric of communities, green urban solutions, which talks about location efficiency, and where you build really does have a big impact on your health and on the environment, and he's going to give us ideas on how to do this. Mr. Lister brings to his role as project manager in the Jonathan Rose Company's planning practice a wide range of experience in architectural design, planning, and project management. Trained as an architect, Mr. Lister has gained an experience in planning, design, entitlements, finance, and construction for a wide variety of architectural and urban design projects throughout the United States. Mr. Lister currently teaches graduate-level planning at the Pratt Institute in New York City and has taught both undergraduate and graduate-level classes at the University of Miami School of Architecture. Mr. Lister has a Master of Science in Real Estate Development from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a Master of Architecture and a Master of Suburb and Town Design from the University of Miami School of Architecture. He holds a Bachelor of Arts and Humanities from the University of Colorado. It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Matthew Lister.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Matthew Lister. I work for Jonathan Rose Companies. We are a multidisciplinary real estate development and planning firm that's based in New York City. I've always been told that it's not a very good idea to come up and speak after somebody who essentially says everything that you're going to say, but better and funnier. So thanks, Ellen. I really appreciate it. I'm going to talk a little bit about a few things. About a year and a half ago, Jonathan Rose Companies, worked with the EPA on this paper, Location Efficiency and Housing Type, boiling it down to BTUs. And just a word of caution, this is one of those examples of where sometimes you say something as a joke and then all of a sudden it actually makes it into the report. So he said, what if we called it boiling it down to BTUs? Wouldn't that be funny? Haha, and now it's out there. So they asked us to look at the relationships between house type and location and the impact on household energy consumption. And so today I'd like to talk a little bit about what we found and how we think it impacts the way people live, but also how it informs and influences the work that we do as a company. So next slide. So as I said before, we studied 3 different house types, which I'll go through in a minute, and we compared the household energy consumption for each house type, and we placed them in transit-oriented development locations and what we're calling conventional suburban development. And I'll get back to what all of this means in just a minute. But first, next slide. I just want to kind of go through what the house types are. And the first one is single-family detached. We all know what this looks like. It looks like more or less like this across the country. Obviously, there are different stylistic differences, and the shapes and sizes of these things change. But for the most part, they have 4 walls on either side. They're not connected to anybody else. And as Ellen mentioned, this has a lot to do with the efficiency of the house. It is also probably one of the predominant forms of housing development throughout the country. Next type. These are single-family attached homes, or as we like to say, row houses or townhouses. They can look very traditional or very modern, depending on what you like or where you are. They tend to be a little bit more efficient because they're sharing walls. Next. And then multifamily, which is essentially condos and apartment buildings, right? And you can find these types of buildings out in suburban environments and also in urban environments, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next slide. So we took each of those house types and we placed them into two generally different locations, right? And the first one is conventional suburban development, which Ellen talked about and explained very well. And then the second is transit-oriented development. Next slide. And the critical difference between those two, as far as this research is concerned, is that conventional suburban development has only you can only move around in this development pattern using the automobile. And in transit-oriented development, you have the option to use transit. Right? So next slide. So we went back to our labs, and we did a lot of really very complicated calculations. We added using very general national averages, we added the household energy consumption of each house type to transportation costs for the automobile and for transit, and we ended up with, next slide, this. And not surprisingly, if you live in a single-family detached house and you rely only on the automobile to move around, you use a lot more energy than if you live in a multifamily house and use transit to get around, right? And so there's several stories in this slide. One is that the type of house that you live in makes a difference in terms of household energy consumption, but more significantly than that, though, is the location, right? So if you see a single-family detached house that has 240 million BTUs annually, if you're living in a transit-oriented development location, which means you're probably using transit to get to and from work, but you might use the car on the weekends and or in the evenings to go to and from the grocery store, you're going to use a lot less energy. And then we added a third layer to this, which is what if you applied green building technologies like Energy Star technologies to the home and then used a Prius. And what we found is that it does make a significant difference, but even with all of the green technology, it still isn't as significant as the location, right? And so this is really important. So next slide. So why does this matter? Next slide. So the big picture stuff is, this is bad for the environment for us to use all this energy, global climate change, bad air quality. The other big picture is that it increases our dependency on foreign oil, right? But we actually think that these are incredibly huge, important issues, but these are not the issues that actually make people decide where they want to live, right? I don't make a decision to move to a neighborhood because I want to reduce our nation's dependency on foreign oil. And I don't really make a decision about the neighborhood that I want to live in based on my concern for the environment, right? There are a lot more factors that go into this. So, next slide. So we had this idea that everybody would know their BTU number, right? That we could run around and say, I'm BTU 240, and I'm BTU 170, and I'm BTU 95, and I'm better than you, and whatever. So, but then we realized that's ridiculous. Like, what, British thermal units? That just really has no bearing whatsoever on the way people live and the things that they find important. Next slide. But there is a truth to it, though, right? That we all sort of do have a BTU number, and that we all the decisions that we make about where we live have an impact on the way we consume energy. Next slide. So people that live in an urban environment and walk a lot and don't use a car have lower numbers than those that have to drive on the freeway, right? So, but more important than the bigger issues actually are these personal issues. And again, these are the reasons why I got into what we do, and these are the reasons that drive the kind of development that we do as a company. And there's sort of three big things, I think. One is resiliency and stability. The second is choice, having the choice to live in a location that meets the needs of your lifestyle. And the third is quality of life, right? And so embedded in this very sort of blunt instrument to tell us about location and housing are these much deeper issues. Next slide. And so what we realize is that what this really represents is that where people live really affects how they live and vice versa, right? So next slide. So when we realized that, we decided that we would stop looking at these numbers and that we would actually stop looking at the house types, and we would actually stop looking at urbanism, and we wanted to just spend a little bit of time kind of diving into what does this mean, like in a in your day-to-day life? What does location efficiency mean, right? And so we've created these composites, these people, and sort of track them through their daily life. And just as a personal aside, I've personally lived in each and every one of the scenarios that we're going to look at. I grew up in Peoria, Illinois, in a single-family house in the suburbs, and I moved to Colorado and got a little more urban, just a tiny bit. And then I moved to Miami and got a lot less urban and drove around everywhere. And then I moved to Washington, D.C. and got a lot more urban, and then sort of made my way up the Eastern Seaboard. And my wife and I now live in New York City, and so we've kind of gone full spectrum from suburban to urban. So I feel a personal connection to all of these stories, right? So this is Dave, right? Next. Dave lives in Milton, Georgia, and he works in Atlanta, Georgia. Next. And this is Dave's neighborhood, right? So Dave lives in conventional suburban development. Next slide. Dave lives in a beautiful home. It's a 4,000 square foot home. He's probably worked very hard and loves the privacy that this home offers him. And I imagine it has granite countertops, you know, and probably a bonus room, which is a lot more room than I have right now, but that's great. Next slide. So this is Dave's car. We actually went back and forth in the office about this because I thought Dave would really probably be more interested in a convertible or something like that. But everyone overrode me and said that Dave is far more sensible and has a family, so he drives this. And it gets 20 miles per gallon. Next slide. So this is a day in the life of Dave, right? And so Dave wakes up, gets in his car, drives 5 miles from home to Starbucks, right? Gets to Starbucks, turns the radio on for the 42-mile drive into the city, to his office, to his place of work. And then after work, he gets in his car again and drives to the gym. And Dave really needs to go to the gym because Dave doesn't walk anywhere, right? And he spends quite a bit of time in the car. After the gym, he goes to the grocery store to pick up whatever he needs, probably once a week because you don't want to be doing that all the time. And then from the grocery store to home. So Dave's day is 90 miles, and he spends 100 minutes in the car. And if you don't think that that has an impact on how you live, you need to look at that number again, 100 minutes. That's a lot of time spent in the car. That's a lot of time not being able to be with your family, not be with your family, right? Watch a baseball game, basically do anything but sit in the car. Next. So then we started to, so this is Dave's profile, right? His BTU profile. So his BTU score is 240. The amount he spends on energy per year, given this, is $5,595, right? He uses 132 million BTUs per year on home energy use and 108 million BTUs per year on transportation use. So then we decided to look a little further and look at these and look at the other house types and other profiles. Next slide. So then we have Sean and Patty, and Sean and Patty also live in a single-family detached house, very similar to Dave's. It might be a little bit smaller because they're in a transit-oriented development location, and so the houses are a little closer together and they're a little more compact. And Sean and Patty actually have the ability to ride transit to work, and so they're spending a lot less time in the car. As they ride the train, they probably have a little bit more time to, like read the paper, maybe talk to one another if that's what they like to do, I don't know. But you can see that their BTU score is much, much lower, and the amount that they spend on energy per year is quite a bit lower too, 3,558. Next slide. So then we get into single family attached, right? And so Judy and Susie live in a townhome. It's probably, it's in a suburban environment. There is no transit, so again, Judy spends a lot of time in her car, unfortunately for Susie. And despite the fact that they have a more efficient home, right, because they have shared walls and there are inherent efficiencies in shared walls, she still spends over $5,000 a year on home energy, or on home and transportation energy consumption. Next slide. But then with the same house type in a transit-oriented development location, Adam spends far less, $2,751, right? Because he's not spending so much time in the car. Next slide. And then we look at Henrietta and Jose, which is our retired couple. They live in a beautiful one-bedroom apartment in the suburbs. Again, I think they probably have granite countertops as well. But they have a very high BTU score as well, because despite the fact that they live in a very, in an efficient multifamily building, they're still driving everywhere, and they're still completely and totally locked into their car. Next slide. So then we end up with Karen, and so we decided to take Karen a little bit. We decided to go through the actual full exercise with Karen. So next slide. So Karen lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Or I'm sorry, she lives in Mount Lebanon, Pennsylvania, and she works in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it's about 6 miles between, right? So she's not walking to work, right? Next slide. This is Karen's home. I think her countertops are Formica. I'm not sure about that, but it's a multifamily building, very hip, cool, right, for Karen. Next slide. This is Karen's car. She actually doesn't have to use it that much, though, because, next slide, she could take light rail to work, right? And so, next slide, when you combine, the ability to take light rail to work with the kinds of locations that she's living and working in, she has a totally different profile than Dave or any of the others, right? So Karen's profile is home to cafe, 0.05 miles. It's essentially across the street, right? The cafe to the train is 1/10 of a mile. She takes the train to the office, that's 6 miles. Office to the gym, 0.05 miles. Gym to the train, 1. Train to the grocery store, another 6, but it's all on the train. And then finally, grocery store to home, 1/10 of a mile. So, but what this illustrates is that compact transit-oriented development allows Karen to meet all of her needs, her daily life needs, around this transit node, right? She can actually do all of this by walking, and then that node is connected by transit to her work node. And so all of her needs are actually met in a walkable environment, right? Next slide. And so her BTU score is significantly lower, right? And the amount of money she spends on energy a year is much, much lower, at $2,000. Next slide. So then we started to ask questions about, and this gets into the idea about resiliency. How do rising energy costs affect us? Next slide. So if we, just for example, decided that energy costs were to increase by 20%, next slide. What you find, this is simple math. If you are, the people that are using a lot more energy right now and by virtue of the fact that, and by virtue of their home and location are required to use that amount of energy, as energy increases, they are far more susceptible to the impacts of an increase in energy, right? So Karen has an increase in energy costs of only $425, where Dave is over $1,100 a year. Next slide. So we need to look into the future a bit and try and understand a little bit more about why that's important. Next slide. So this is actually, I'm just going to reiterate something that Ellen said, which is that, next slide, that we have a huge demographic shift that's happening over the course of the next 10 to 20 years. The largest cohort, demographic cohort in the country is the baby boomers, which is people like Dave, right? And so, and then the second largest, which they call an echo boom, is the millennials, right? Next slide. And so Dave is in this big cohort, and then Karen is sort of behind in this second larger but still large cohort of people. And what this means, though, is that you're going to have a huge, significant population that moves from working into retirement, right? And that a large section of that population is actually going to be, as they move into retirement, will be far more susceptible to energy increases, because as they move into retirement, they'll be on a fixed income, for example. And so a 20% increase in their energy costs for lots of these people will be the difference between making it and not making it, right? And so, that's part of the resiliency thing. And then the next part of this is that, as Ellen said, that both of these cohorts actually represent a large new market for transit-oriented development. That people like Dave are going to be aging actively, they're going to be looking for environments that are not isolating like conventional suburban development is. They're also, despite the fact that they're hanging onto their keys, they are not going to want to be, at a certain point, you can't drive anymore. And if you're sitting in a home in the suburbs and you can't drive anymore, then your life is over, essentially, right? You rely on everyone else to try and for your daily needs, right? And so if you're within a walkable environment, you can extend that time that you are independent, right? And then Karen, I mean, the thing about Karen and the millennials, as Ellen said, is that they're actually hungry for the culture and the choices and the options that transit-oriented development, compact mixed-use urbanism will provide. So next slide. So the point is that it's not just about money, actually. That money is important, but the really important thing is that the benefits that come from transit-oriented development are those things that will allow people the opportunity to fulfill their lifestyle, right? And fulfill their lifestyle needs. So, and the reason that this can happen is that transit-oriented development is, as we've seen, is compact, it's very well connected, it's walkable, it's integrated with transit, it's mixed use, and it provides, and it allows for a mix of incomes, right? Next slide. And why that's important is because, when we talk about factors that influence the quality of a person's life, it's these things, right? It's not really street width or, so a lot of the things that we talk about as architects and urban designers, it's these things, right? It's being able to stay active and healthy. It's having access to education, which can provide you with opportunity. It's finding places that are very energetic, but also finding places that allow you to feel calm. It's being part of a community. It's having access to fun and entertainment, and again, as Ellen said, food, right? Food is very important. It's having a mix of incomes so that you have the opportunity to engage within the community, right? That there is an affordability to the market so that any one of us could actually be a part of that place. And I think really most importantly is offering people as many choices as possible, right? So I'm not particularly advocating that Dave is wrong or that Karen is right. What I'm advocating is that we need to have many, many, many more choices for people so that Karen or Dave can make the decision to live in one place or another, right? Next. So one more quick profile. So this is Erica and Matt. My wife will kill me. Next slide. So this is their home. Next slide. It's about the size of a shoebox, right? Next slide. But it's just steps away from the dry cleaner. I live across the street from a grocery store, which is, by the way, this is probably the most significant improvement in my quality of life that I've ever experienced, ever, right? Because it's just incredible to be able to be cooking something, right? And then you're like, oh no, I forgot the cinnamon. And then just walk out the door and get this. That's my pantry. It's just fantastic. So the pharmacy is just around the corner. There's more restaurants than I can possibly imagine just around the corner. I'm a planner, so I don't go to them that often, but it just makes me feel better to walk past them, to know that they're there and that to tell people that I live near them. There's a bakery there. I'm like 4 blocks away from the subway and 4 stops away from work. So if you did my BTU profile, it would be practically nothing. I spend like maybe 6% of my income on transit. But again, this is all, the point that I'm trying to make with this is that this is the choice that Erica and I made, right? And we were lucky that we were able to make this choice. And it really, honestly, it had nothing to do with, we didn't go, we had to live here because we want to reduce our dependency on foreign oil. Or we want to make a conscious decision to live in a place that will help us mitigate the effects of global climate change. and we're willing to live in 340 square feet to do that. No, I mean, this is about lifestyle, right? And it's about offering people the chance to take part in this. Next slide. So, fundamentally, I think this is about how it affects our work, and how I think it affects all the things that we're all thinking about going forward. Is that the important thing about the BTU slide is that we have to increase opportunities for people to choose places that can offer all of this, right? That can offer activity and health and energy and calm and education and opportunity and access and affordability and food and fun and entertainment. And that those are the places that, Karen wants to live in, right? And those are the places that Dave probably will want to live in, because I imagine after, 10 more years, he's going to get tired of mowing that lawn, and he'll be much more interested in, I don't know, maybe seeing a show. So, next slide. So what that really means is that we have to get really serious about planning for, supporting, and developing more places like this, right? Next slide. So that sort of, all of this is the sort of big picture story that informs the way that Jonathan Rose Companies works, and the way that we've actually set up the company, which is we have 4 practice areas. One is planning, and that's where I'm from. That's what I do. The second one is civic development, and civic development was set up basically as an owner's representation group to help cities and municipalities and nonprofits develop and build the cultural facilities, the libraries, the ballets, the schools, basically those facilities that enrich a place and make it a more interesting place to be in, because we feel that cities actually have to have all of these pieces, that it's not just about housing and transportation, that it's not just about the grocery store, but it's also about enriching people's lives through culture and through learning. Jonathan actually calls this the sort of software of a place. So that's civic development. And then development, our development group develops affordable housing primarily from the ground up. And we do that in kind of all over the country. We've done that in Stamford, Connecticut, and I'm going to show you a project from there, Albuquerque, New York City, and Denver, Colorado. And then the investment group kind of puts our money where our mouth is when it comes to smart growth. They've raised, I think, one of the first smart growth investment funds ever. And what they do is they find those really sort of unique core properties that are a little bit underperforming in cities in the country that have transit or have decided to invest in transit. And so, if you walk through some of this is the Vance building, it's actually in Seattle. And if you walk through some of these cities, we all see these buildings, you go, God, it's such a beautiful old building. It's totally empty. What's wrong? What's happening here? And so we actually see that as an opportunity to come in and redevelop the property. And what we do is we use old school real estate investing principles, right? So before 20 years ago, people used to invest in real estate for a long-term hold. The money was not about, the money that you earned or the return that you earned was not about development and then sell off, right? It was about develop something for the long term, hold it for the long term, and a real estate investment provided a very stable, a decent return, but a stable long-term return, right? Which is, I think, by the way, we're probably going to return to that right now, because we've seen over the last several years that the other model, of blow and go development is actually a little bit bankrupt, right? So the Vance building we purchased several years ago, and because we want to build these things, we want to develop these things for the long term. The significant thing is that we green the building, right? And what that does from an economic perspective is just lower operating expenses for the long term, which obviously would improve your return over the long term. And then because the greening efforts actually make them really healthy spaces to be in, low VOC paints. Better air quality control, better lighting. We do things like light shades in all of the windows so natural light comes further into the center of the building. Even in these older buildings, actually, that works. But what we found is that in addition to lowered operating expenses, they become really popular places. And so they fill up and lease up very, very quickly, and they stay leased up. So this building actually was more or less vacant, and then after it redeveloped, it's become the home to like all of the coolest green and environmental entrepreneurs in Seattle. And it used to be at the edge of sort of at the edge of the downtown in terms of the vibrancy of this place. You know, you probably wouldn't walk down this street before this happened because nothing was happening, and now it's sort of in the center of where things are happening in Seattle. So next slide. So we approach development with this understanding of sustainability. So development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And we think about the environment, economy, and equity. These are three really important sort of key principles to the work that we do. And then the other thing that we've kind of been tooling around with lately is this idea that you know, we're trying to increase people's capacity to be happy. That it's not just about a financial return, that you know, a truly successful development, both from a market perspective and from a social perspective, is a place that people have a very good quality of life. Right. So our mission is to repair and strengthen the fabric of communities while preserving the land around them. Next slide. So I'm going to just go through a few projects that we've done. This is a planning project. The planning practice actually operates, we work with municipalities and nonprofits at multiple scales. So we're actually doing the comprehensive master plan for the city of Newark, which is an entirely different story. And if you know anything about Newark, it's complicated and exciting, I guess would be the way to put it. So we operate at that scale, and then we also, because of the real estate implementation experience, we find ourselves doing a lot of work on smaller scale opportunities to reimagine the redevelopment of inner city properties, right? And so we do community-based engagement and community-based planning around the redevelopment of those properties, but we're probably one of the few planners that are actually running pro formas at the same time. Which is one of the reasons why I enjoy working there. So, but this project was actually another policy piece that we did, again in cooperation with the EPA. They asked us to go up to Hartford, Connecticut, in the Capital Region Council of Governments, what they call CROG, had selected 4 or 5 suburban infill sites, actually, and I hesitate to talk about that at all because Ellen is such the expert on all of that, but what they asked us to do was to use those 3 or 4 sites as sort of an R&D, like research and development, to develop a user-friendly set of smart growth design and development guidelines. And so this is that, and you can find them on the EPA Smart Growth website, actually. There are a number of great, very detailed guidelines and criteria sets out there. Lead&D is an amazing one. What we tried to do with this was sort of be like a starter drug before Lead&D, right? The stepping stone, so that municipalities or smaller municipalities that would be a bit overwhelmed by all of the great stuff that's in Lead&D could sort of get their feet wet with these guidelines. And so we arranged these guidelines in sort of 3 key categories. The idea is you start regionally, and you don't do smart growth development without really picking the right location first. We just talked about location efficiency and how important that is. Once you've found the right location, you really have to make sure that you develop that location in a way that creates a great place that people want to be in, that's walkable. And then going from the neighborhood and block scale down to the building, in order to sort of complete the picture of sustainability, you want to install green building and sustainable infrastructure when you're redeveloping. So next slide. So the guidelines are far more in depth than this, so I'm just sort of quickly going through this. The key points of the prosperous smart growth locations component of the guidelines is that, preserve, to the extent possible, preserve natural resources, protect environmentally sensitive areas. This is particularly important in a place like Connecticut, where the amount of land untouched land that exists is rapidly dwindling. Prime agricultural soils are rapidly dwindling. And so it doesn't make much sense to continue to develop on those places, especially when, as Alan pointed out, there are so many interesting gray field sites that could be redeveloped and could become very, very useful places again. So one way to do that, too, is to make sure that any new development is actually tied to existing development and infrastructure connections. And this is very important, too, for the efficient use of public resources in these small municipalities, because every time that somebody develops further out and leapfrogs, it's another investment that the municipality has to make generally in infrastructure that they then need to maintain for the long term. So, this is really an economic decision that public municipalities need to make as well. To the extent possible, new smart growth locations need to be connected to transportation. And I don't need to say much more about that because we saw the significant impact on what that means for the way that people live, right? And then finally, because these communities need to be vibrant and sort of rich places, that it's better to locate new development near community services, right? Near places that already have the infrastructure for community. Next slide. So then once you go from the site, the smart site location, you go into neighborhood plan and placemaking. There's extensive stuff written about this, but the 4 key things are: create a really great feeling neighborhood fabric and composition, develop streets that are that foster community, that people can walk on, that are comfortable walking on, that aren't given entirely to the car. Incorporate, to the extent possible, nature and open space into these urban environments, and provide for a mix of incomes and a mix of uses so that people at all scales of the sort of socioeconomic spectrum have the opportunity to participate. Next slide. And then finally, that's all the planning, but when you get into the bricks and mortar, there are a number of things that you can do to make sure that what you're building is sustainable in the long term. And certainly high-performance buildings, using green building materials, using sustainable and indigenous landscaping, installing green infrastructure, using green construction best practices. And then also, because it's not just about the bricks and mortar, it's about making sure that behaviors change too. And if it's one thing to install a really high-performance HVAC system into a building, but if nobody really knows how to use it or decides not to use it, it's kind of, well, it is waste. It's a huge waste, right? So, and lots of times these things are incredibly easy to do, actually, and so it's just a matter of really being thoughtful and empathetic about the way people live in these buildings and making sure that they're accessing to the furthest extent possible the benefits of the things that you're installing. Next. So I'm just going to go sort of quickly through a few projects. So this was a project. This is a project in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We have a smart site location. It's right across from a recently refurbished transit center. Silver Gardens is and I'm going to sort of cheat right now on some of the stats for this, but you can go to the next slide, please. So Silver Gardens is a 77,000 square foot development project. It's about $12.5 million, at least the first phases. It was completed about a year ago. It's actually won several awards for Green Building Awards. I believe that it ended up at LEED Platinum certification. And we actually use LEED as a certification, but we also use the Enterprise Green Communities guidelines as well. Next slide. So this is actually phase 2, I believe, and we're still working on the wind turbine thing. We'll see how that ends up. This is financed by multiple financing sources. There are low-income housing tax credits in this project. It's a mixed income project, so low, medium, and moderate income people can live here. It's very colorful. Next slide. And even within a single block project like this, we think it's important to provide spaces for community. And so this project incorporates a central courtyard, and then as much as we can within this kind of desert environment, right, provide green spaces. The next one is in Stamford, Connecticut. Looks like the S slipped there. Next slide. So again, this is located right next to transit. This is the Metro North Line and Amtrak, actually. Next slide. And this is a multi-phase project that has, next slide. So what's interesting about this one too is that it's really embedded right into the fabric of the city. It's at the edge of a revitalizing neighborhood. It's very close to a significant job center, and obviously the train station is just right there. You couldn't really be any closer to the train station without actually living in the train station. Next. And so it's a multi-phase project. The Metro Green apartments at the bottom were completed about a year ago and have completely leased up. That's a 100% affordable housing project. At a mix of incomes, again, like the others that we do. Everything that we do is a mix of incomes because we feel like that it's incredibly important for the resiliency of a place for there to be that mix of incomes, right? There's 2 other phases that are currently under development, including the residential garage. The lofts, and then the Green Residences building. The Green Residences building, I believe, is going to be will include market rate units. Next slide. So there's a picture of that. That's the rendering. It actually looks almost exactly like the rendering, so you'll just have to believe me on that one. Next slide. Again, like all of the other projects that we do, we think it's incredibly important to provide these open spaces that are sort of deeply connected to the building to provide people a place to be outside and engage. This one is actually cut onto the corner of the street, so it's like a little piazza, which is important because it allows for people as they're approaching the building, even if they don't live there, to take part in the sort of public nature of that space. Next slide. This is another street view. That's actually the second phase, which is not under construction yet. Next. Under construction. Next. So then this is the last project. So this one is particularly interesting, I think, because it shows how you can accommodate a huge variety of mixed types within a relatively small site. It actually accommodates a huge variety of uses as well. It's a 27-acre infill site in Denver that was started in the mid-90s and completed in around, I think, 2006. It's called Highlands Garden Village. Next slide. This one is really fascinating because it used to be an amusement park. And so there were all these incredible memories that people had, you know, that lived near here. People lived across the street from an amusement park. I mean, if you're a kid, that's like, it doesn't compute. But there were a lot of sensitivities to how this site would be redeveloped, obviously, because it held a special place in the hearts of a lot of people, right? But at the same time, you know, it sat defunct for quite some time before there was any redevelopment, so there also was sort of harboring resentment about this big dead spot in the middle of the neighborhood, right? So this process actually underwent probably countless neighborhood meetings and discussions and work with the city, work with residents, to come up with a plan that people were more or less aligned behind. And you know, that's an important point about redeveloping in cities, I think, is that I think, you know, we sort of hear, you know, developers get a bad name when they're not, because they come in and just say, you're going to have this, right? And that the numbers suggest, actually demand that this will be what you have, right? And you know, there's a lot of animosity because a lot of bad stuff was built as a result of that, and stuff that people didn't have a say in, right? And so we really strongly believe that a community engagement process or a civic engagement process is absolutely vital to the success of these kinds of developments. And what we found, in addition to just being great PR for the work that you're doing, and that as you move forward with a complex development project, having consensus behind you, right, is just makes a lot of sense economically too, because you're not going to spend as much time in the entitlements process. But what we found is if you do it right, you actually learn a lot, right? You learn a lot about the way, you know, you should be imagining this new place, right? The people that live next door to these places know a lot better than you what it is, right, or what it could be or what it should be, right? An example of that is we were working in Newark in a neighborhood called the Ironbound, which is a strong sort of Portuguese Brazilian neighborhood. And they had a 22-acre beer brewery site. I don't have pictures of it here, but they had a 22-acre beer brewery site that was the sort of beating heart of the neighborhood until 1979 when the brewery left, right? So imagine an incredibly tightly knit community and dense neighborhood, and at the center of it is 22 acres, right? That just vanishes. Right? And so people actually call it like Black Friday when it happened. And then somebody came in a year and a half later and bought the place and then bricked up all the windows, right, and turned it into warehousing, which is no jobs and trucks, right? No jobs and trucks. So since 1980, that place has been this giant mark, this giant open wound essentially in the neighborhood. And what we said about the site was that it's not a place anymore, it's just a memory, right? So everybody remembers what it was. And because of that, they actually couldn't imagine what it could be because they were always sort of locked into the memory of the place, right? So, but we went through a sort of, an empathetic engagement process with the community and kind of walked through the potential of what things could be. And this is an example of how you actually learn from the community. So we were hired to go in there and figure out zoning recommendations that could be given over to the city and then rezoned so that when the market turned and it could be redeveloped, that what was redeveloped was actually what reflected what the community wanted to see, right? And so we thought, this is going to be a big, long, arduous discussion about housing and density, right? Because that's what we're used to hearing. It's going to be about 3 stories or 4 stories. It's going to be about affordability. It's going to be about all these things. So we went in and we were totally prepared for that discussion. And within 3 minutes of the first meeting, we realized, no, they don't want housing. None. They want jobs, right? And so because of that engagement, right? I mean, that's sort of oversimplifying things, but because of that engagement, the idea for that project, that 22 acres, shifted from a housing development significantly to become what we're calling a green job center. So it's about reopening the windows in this place and bringing new light, sustainable manufacturing uses back into the neighborhood, right? And so, a developer would have come in and said, this is housing, let's raise it, let's do housing. But the opportunity and by the way, the returns are going to be pretty good on the light manufacturing because it turns out there's actually a significant demand for small manufacturing spaces in that area, right? So it makes sense economically, but it also makes sense socially. So anyway, back to Highlands Garden Village. Next slide. So this is after demolition. What you'll notice is that, all the roller coasters came down, unfortunately. We couldn't quite figure out how to make a roller coaster into housing. Maybe we didn't talk to the right people. I mean, maybe the children would have helped on that. But there was this incredibly beautiful theater, actually, you can see sort of in the center of the site, and this even more beautiful carousel. And that carousel was home to countless first kisses, right? Countless romantic moments, right? Countless memories, right? And so it was really important to kind of identify those things in the site and say, this is the character of the place. We can preserve it and then build off of it, right? Next slide. So this is the plan that we came up with. We worked with Peter Calthorpe, and I believe there's 306 housing units on the site. 1 minute left? 1 minute left like 5 minutes ago, right? Okay. So we'll just go quickly through it. But so the next slide. So there's a variety of housing types here. You have multifamily. Next slide. Single family. The single family is actually aligned on the side of the blocks that's facing the existing single family, so it blends seamlessly into the neighborhood. Next slide. We have a type called co-housing, actually, and co-housing is basically a community of like-minded people coming together and sort of saying, you know what, we want to develop a community of a residential community for ourselves, and what people that do that do, in this case at least, is they sort of agreed that they were going to take smaller and more compact housing units and sort of live closer together and use the land a little bit more efficiently. Next slide. And then they also participate with each other in these community gardens. It's really actually quite beautiful. Next slide. Here's a community garden. Another one. For a variety of reasons, including stormwater management, it was important to put green spaces throughout the site. And so if you look back at the plan, you would see them very well incorporated throughout the site. Next slide. Going back to the co-housing, they actually built a communal sort of building that houses a large kitchen, and they have a weekly meal together. They do have a parking problem. Next slide. Yeah, we didn't. The parking densities the ratios are all wrong here. We'll try and figure that out for the next time. Next slide. So this just is also showing that variety of house type is important. So these are single-family homes, but there's a different, there are different kinds. Some of these homes actually have accessory units above the garages. So, you could imagine those being used for, people returning home from college, but also, I think they're called granny flats for a reason. Next slide. More green. Next slide. So this is interesting too. I mean, we actually. One of the things that they attempted at first, we wanted to do xeriscaping, and some of the builders said no way, and so we put in grass, and then that failed, and so we went back to the xeriscaping. Next slide, and it looks really great. Next slide. This is just another picture of the co-housing. Next slide. So this is a seniors building, right? So this is actually a affordable housing project specifically for seniors. One of the really great things about having this in the place is that you actually broaden not only the socioeconomic spectrum but the age spectrum, and there's really great benefits to having children, people from all steps of life living in the same place. Next slide. This is another affordable multifamily project. Next slide. So the other component of the project, because we wanted to try and meet the sort of walkable needs of people, is the commercial part. And Chuck Perry, who's head of Perry Rosen, will tell you that this was the most difficult part, that the housing was quite easy in terms of development, but actually getting the commercial to go was very difficult. But they managed to do it and finished it in 2006. It includes doctors, there's a liquor store, I think, there's a wine shop, there is a Starbucks, health club, all sorts of things. Next. And then it also has a 28,000 square foot grocery store, which was, I believe, one of the first LEED corn shell grocery stores ever. This was incredibly difficult because 28,000 square feet is actually a really weird size for a grocery store. But luckily, these people, Sunflower Markets, had developed a model that works for that size. One of the things that we struggled with is we really pushed hard to get the parking ratios down. So I think we went from 1 per 200 square feet to 1 per 350 square feet. And actually that became a difficulty for us because the retailers were having, they weren't quite sure they wanted to move in here. And so we had to get some people in to sort of prove the concept, and now it's going. Although parking is in high demand there still. Next. So there's the market. Next. Okay, and finally, one really important aspect of this place, and I think all great urban development is having really fantastic public space. This is a stormwater retention feature, but it's actually the main sort of lawn plaza for the project, and it sits right at the terminus of this beautiful historic theater. Next slide. And so people use this for movies in the evening. It's filled a lot with programming. Next slide. In the daytime as well. I don't know. That guy in the middle doesn't look too happy though. I don't know what his deal is. Next slide. Again, just the different age groups that are in the neighborhood. Next slide. And then this is just the interior of the carousel. And what you see in there is a labyrinth, and because that's just sort of like signifying that this space could also be a contemplative space, and that it's important to have places to be quiet, right? So lots of wonderful life moments happening here still, weddings, big family gatherings and so on. So that's it. I went way over my time, I guess. So thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. What just an empowering presentation. Broome and Tioga, can we do this?
Yes.
Yes, we can. You've given a whole new meaning to shoeboxes.
Yeah.
You and your wife are definitely sustainability superheroes, and I commend you.
I'll just say that it works for two people, but if you're planning on moving into a different phase of your life, So yeah, we're looking for a new place.
Great. We have time for about 2 questions. Anybody in the audience?
I thought all of that was great. We don't have a lot of transit here, and just bus service, so I think a lot of people are probably thinking, well, how does this all relate to us type of thing. But when you look at our area and the underperforming asphalt and vacant spaces here in the urban core and things like that, could you just talk a little bit about maybe how these same type of concepts can be scaled for an area like, Triple Cities here, Binghamton, Endicott, Johnson City? Right.
Well, so this is similar to, I think this is quite similar to the towns that we were looking at around Hartford, Connecticut. They actually have, I apologize, do you have buses here? Or? Yeah. Okay, so they have buses there, and they're, but let's be honest, not many people are riding those, and so this idea that you would take the bus into the city is probably a bit far-fetched right now. For those places around, I'm going to talk a little bit about Hartford because I think I'll talk about that from a place of knowledge rather than here. But I mean, one of the really, so here's the thing. I think the country has to commit to regional planning efforts, actually. I mean, that's the big thing, right? And some wonderful things have actually started happening, right? Over the last couple of years, we've seen this incredible thing happen where HUD decided that maybe it makes sense, if we're talking about affordable housing, to talk to DOT, right? And DOT said if we want to make sure that we're developing in a sustainable way, we should maybe talk to the EPA. So, they formed the Sustainable Communities, Livable Communities Partnership, right? Which is deployed right now, lots and lots of federal funding to do regional and local planning for the employment of things like transit, right? So CROG actually got a large sustainable communities grant, and they're going to start studying these things, right? So that's difficult, and I understand that. So I think alternatively, though, and this is to what Ellen talks about a lot, is that even if you're not connecting these places by transit, that there's still a huge opportunity to make them more walkable within themselves, right? And that just by making sure that you meet more needs of people within a walkable place, you're going to really start reducing car trips, right? I mean, again, if I can walk across the street to go to the grocery store instead of drive 5 miles, and I have to go to the grocery store twice a week, like those things start to add up. So I don't know if that's particularly satisfying, but that's.
My name is Chris Carrick. I manage the energy program for the Central New York Regional Planning Board. We were one of the 800 communities that did not get one of those HUD grants.
Yeah.
But we did receive a grant from the EPA through the Climate Showcase Communities program.
Oh, actually, that was what the thing that we did with CROG. I think that was funded under the same grant. So
we're providing assistance to 9 communities to do smart growth planning. And one of the things we're trying to work with EPA on is how to quantify making some of these smart growth retrofits in terms of carbon benefits, and we're having a hard time doing that. And I'm wondering if the BTU tool that you've developed could be ramped up and applied on a community scale in terms of helping the planning.
I'm actually really glad that you asked that question, because so the BTU, it's really an illustration more than anything of a concept, and the reason why I say that is because we were only able to use only the highest level data, national average data, right? And as soon as you start looking into the specifics of a place, those numbers are going to fluctuate, obviously, right? Because, one place has buses, the other place has New York City has the subway, and, that's totally different than the transit that Atlanta has, right? And so one of the things that we recommend at the end of this paper is that really, this is just the very, very, very beginning of studying this issue, and that what we need to do is actually do the same exercise at the regional level, maybe even the neighborhood level, just to understand more specifically what the impacts are at these places. And one of the things, again, that we talk about a lot in our practice right now is that there are huge opportunities out there for us to learn a lot more about this stuff rapidly. And one of the reasons is because we've all got these things, right? Something like one of these things, and so we're all essentially sensors, and so there's all this tremendous data that's out there that can be captured and can be used to sort of quantify the benefits, and basically to quantify human mobility, right? And so one of the things that we'd like to do is maybe create an iPhone app or some kind of app actually that would give us, volunteer geographic information that would actually let us sort of dive in a more fine-grained way to understanding what that really is, what that BTU slide really is. And I think that's important for two reasons. One is because we need to start quantifying this stuff in a better way. But the other is we have to start communicating to people what these decisions mean to them, right? And we can't communicate to them in this sort of punitive way, right? Like this way that says, you're burning too much gas and you're doing this, Like that's not particularly compelling to anybody, right? What's compelling is when you can talk about quality of life. Like, how does this stuff actually affect the quality of your life, and how it will affect the quality of life of your children? And so I'm really interested in developing ways that we can research this stuff that not only gives us the data, but actually is a PR campaign for understanding better how these decisions affect our lives. So, thank you.
Thank you again, Matthew. And I think I have your next campaign with Ellen, building a better burb to reduce your BMI and BTU. Are we ready to go? We also wanted to be a rosebud here in Broome and Tioga County for you to embark on your next project. So tell Jonathan Rose.